Here is a kind of silence that only exists between stars. Not the silence of a room when conversation dies, nor the silence of a forest at midnight when every animal holds its breath. This is something older and colder than either of those things. It is the silence of distance so vast that even light grows tired crossing it, and sound, poor fragile sound, never stood a chance at all. We called it the deep quiet. Our poets wrote of it as a cradle. Our philosophers called it truth in its purest form. Our admirals for 2,000 years called it safety. My name is Drevath Kyle Sunori, and I was born into a civilization that had never lost a war. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what happened. To have never lost a war is not simply to have won every battle. It is something deeper, something that seeps into the marrow of a culture across generations, until winning feels not like achievement, but like gravity, simply the natural direction in which things fall. The Sarathi dominion had expanded across 22 star systems over 11 centuries. We had encountered 41 intelligent species. Of those 41, 17 had eventually submitted, 14 had been absorbed, 7 had been relocated, and 3 had been, how did our historians phrase it, resolved. We did not call it conquest, we called it integration. The distinction mattered deeply to us. I wonder sometimes now if that distinction mattered at all. I was Fleet Second of the 9th Expansion Arm when the Dominion Council first voted to assess the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star in what our charts designated as Outer Fringe Sector 7 Gamma. The planet had been flagged 17 years earlier by a long-range survey probe.
The survey noted atmospheric nitrogen-oxygen composition, liquid water on approximately 71% of surface area, radio frequency electromagnetic emissions consistent with early technological development, one large natural satellite. The probe had photographed surface structures from orbit. Cities, the survey concluded. Primitive, grid pattern roads, visible light pollution at nightside terminator, no evidence of spacefaring capability. The Council had reviewed the file and set it aside. There was no urgency. The species, whatever they were, had not yet reached their own moon in significant numbers. They were, by every Sarathi metric of civilizational advancement, perhaps 200 years from anything resembling a threat. In the meantime, their system sat at the edge of a resource corridor the Dominion wished to develop, and their star's particular spectral output made the region ideal for long-range communication relay stations. The vote was 17-2. The two dissenters cited caution, not because they feared the planet's inhabitants, but because the survey data was 17 years old and the Dominion had learned, in its long history, that even primitive species could develop unevenly. One councillor, a woman of the Terthari caste whose name I will not record here because she does not deserve to be forgotten, said this: "The fact that they are broadcasting radio signals and have not yet destroyed themselves with their own weapons is itself unusual. Most species at this stage of development are self-terminating. These ones appear to still be here." The other 15 councillors laughed. The motion passed. The 9th Expansion Arm was authorized to dispatch a preliminary assessment fleet. That fleet was mine to command. I reviewed the survey data 6 times during the voyage. I told myself it was thoroughness. In truth, I think I was looking for a reason to feel something other than routine. I did not find one, not yet. We departed Sarathi Prime on the 41st day of the 7th cycle, in the year 2147 of the Dominion calendar. 11 ships, the Vethara, my flagship, 3 heavy cruisers, 4 patrol vessels, and 3 dedicated survey craft. By Sarathi standards, a moderate force for an initial assessment, enough to demonstrate capability if the locals proved troublesome. More than enough, we all assumed, to handle any resistance a pre-space civilization could possibly mount. The voyage took 63 days. I used that time to study everything the survey probe had recorded. Electromagnetic signals, decoded partially by our linguistics division, fragmented images, audio transmissions of remarkable variety, music, I eventually understood, of a complexity that surprised me. News broadcasts, something that appeared to be entertainment programming, fictional dramas about conflict and love and survival, often indistinguishable from each other. I found myself, in the long evenings of deep transit, watching these transmissions on a low-resolution screen in my quarters, not understanding the language, and yet finding something in the rhythm of the voices, the expressiveness of the faces, the strange urgency with which these creatures appeared to feel everything, that I could not quite name or dismiss. Fleet 3rd Vanessa Holt, my second in command, a sharp woman of the Velhari military caste who had served under me for 9 years, caught me watching one of these transmissions on the 3rd week of transit. She stood in my doorway for a moment without speaking, then said, "You are studying the target species." I said, "I am reviewing the survey material." She said, "You have been reviewing the survey material for 19 days. I said, "The survey material is extensive." She looked at the screen, where 2 of the planet's inhabitants were engaged in what appeared to be an argument of considerable emotional intensity, and said, "They are very loud for a pre-space species." I said, "They are very alive for a pre-space species." She left without responding. I watched the screen for a while longer. Then I turned it off and reviewed the tactical projections instead, because that was what a Fleet 2nd was supposed to do. Part 2. First light on a strange world. We dropped out of transit velocity at the edge of their solar system, at a distance calculated to be beyond any electromagnetic detection capability their civilization had yet demonstrated. Standard procedure. You observe before you announce. You count the variables before you step into the room. This was wisdom earned across 11 centuries and 41 first contacts, and we did not deviate from it simply because the target appeared primitive. What we observed in the first 48 hours reshaped, gradually and with growing discomfort, several of my assumptions. Their planet, which they called Earth, a word meaning something approximately equivalent to soil or ground, which I found either humble or revealing, had changed in 17 years. The survey probe's data had estimated a population of approximately 7 billion individuals. Our initial scans suggested the number was closer to 8 billion. They had grown, and they had not slowed. The electromagnetic signature of the planet had intensified significantly. More broadcasts, more power generation, more light. But the thing that made Fleet 3rd Holt go very quiet for a long moment, and then call me to the observation deck without explanation, was what we found in orbit. They had a space station. Not a large one by any standard we recognized. A long, segmented cylinder in a mid-altitude orbit, pressurized and crewed, visited regularly by vessels launched from the surface below. It was, by any objective measure, modest. Perhaps 60 of their crew equivalents aboard at any time, based on power output analysis. But it existed. 17 years ago, the probe had detected only rudimentary satellite technology, communications relays, weather monitoring, a few experimental platforms. Now there was a structure that humans lived in orbit, as a matter of operational routine. And there were more structures further out. A lunar base, small, partially buried, but active. Power signatures on the surface of their large moon consistent with habitation, not just equipment. And beyond that, in the belt of rocky debris between their 4th and 5th planets, a network of automated mining installations. I stood on the observation deck and looked at the tactical overlay and felt, for the first time in my career, a sensation I can only describe as recalibration. Not fear, not alarm. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. The feeling of having measured a room and then walked in and found it larger than the measuring suggested. 17 years. They had done all of this in 17 years. Not because they knew we were coming. Not because anything had changed in their external environment. Simply because this was what they did. They expanded. They reached. They built. I called a senior staff briefing. 12 officers gathered in the Vithara's command chamber, around the circular table where the holographic tactical display showed Earth and its surrounding infrastructure in cool blue light. I presented the updated assessment without commentary, and let the silence after do the work. Fleet Survey Commander Teth Aaron spoke first.
He was an older officer, methodical, not given to drama, which is why I trusted his observation more than most. He said, "The development curve is steeper than the standard model predicts for a species at this stage, significantly steeper." I said, "By how much?" He said, "The standard model for nitrogen-oxygen civilizations at early electromagnetic development projects, roughly 40 years to first permanent orbital habitation, 90 to 100 years to lunar surface operations, 140 to 200 years to significant extraplanetary resource extraction. These humans have reached all three benchmarks simultaneously, inside 17 years of our initial observation." Someone at the table, I believe it was Sub-Commander Vel Rath, said, "That is impossible. The standard model has been validated across 31 separate first contacts." Teth Aaron said, "And yet." There was another silence. I looked at the blue hologram of the Earth. 8 billion beings on that bright marble, and they were already reaching into the dark, not because they were prepared, not because conditions were ideal, but because they could not seem to stop themselves from reaching. I thought of the transmissions I had watched during transit, the voices, urgent with feeling, the faces, lit by emotion, the stories about survival and conflict and love, always in motion, always building towards something. I said, "We proceed with caution. No active scanning, no signal emissions. We observe for a full 15-day cycle before making any decision about contact or assessment approach." There were nods around the table. There were also, I noted, no objections of the kind that had accompanied previous cautionary recommendations. The polite, barely concealed impatience of officers who felt that caution was unnecessary when the subject of caution was clearly outmatched. There were no such expressions now. The room had absorbed what the data showed and arrived, collectively, at the same quiet recalibration I had experienced alone on the observation deck. We watched them for 15 days. It was, in retrospect, the most important education of my life, and I understood almost none of what it was teaching me in real time. What I observed in those 15 days, 17 separate nations launched objects into orbit. Not one nation, not a single unified space program operating under central authority. 17 different political entities, many of them apparently in competition with one another on the surface below, all simultaneously engaged in the project of leaving their planet. Some of the launches were government-operated. Some, and this detail took our analysis team 3 days to confirm, because it seemed improbable, some were operated by private commercial enterprises, companies, as they called them. Organizations whose primary motivation, as best we could determine, was financial profit. These organizations were building space infrastructure because it was profitable to do so. I asked Teth Aaron what the nearest Sorathi equivalent would be, and he thought about it for a long time and said, "We don't have one. In our history, space development has always been a state function, a civilization-level project. The idea that private entities would develop space capability independently of the state for profit in parallel with state programs. We have no model for that." I said, "Is it a problem for them, the lack of coordination?" He said, "I would have assumed so, but observationally, it appears to be an accelerant. Competition appears to drive development speed in a way that centralized planning does not. They are," he paused, searching for the right framing, "they are developing their space capability the same way they appear to have developed everything else, chaotically. In competition, from multiple directions simultaneously, and somehow arriving at functional outcomes faster than a more coordinated approach would produce." I filed that observation. I did not yet understand why it mattered. Part 3. The moment we should have turned around. On the 16th day, Fleet 3rd Holt came to my quarters at the end of the night cycle and sat down without being invited. which she had not done in 9 years of service. I looked up from my data terminal and waited. She had the expression of someone who has organized what they want to say several times and keeps finding the organization inadequate. She said, "I want to formally register a concern." I said, "Register it." She said, "The development curve, the infrastructure distribution, the multi-directional expansion pattern." I have been running these numbers against the Council's assessment framework, and I keep getting the same result, which is that the assessment framework does not adequately account for this kind of growth profile. The Council authorized this mission on the assumption that the target civilization was effectively static relative to our arrival window. It is not static. It is accelerating. I said, "I know." She said, "If the acceleration curve holds, and I have no evidence to suggest it will not, then our assessment window is narrower than the Council anticipated. Not by years, potentially by decades. We may be looking at a species that reaches meaningful spacefaring capability, not in the projected 200 years, but in 30, perhaps 20. I said, "What is your recommendation?" She looked at me for a moment with an expression I had not seen on her face before, and then said, "I think we should go home and tell the Council what we actually found, and let them decide what to do with information that the original assessment framework cannot accommodate." It was, I know now, the right answer. It was the answer that would have changed everything if we had gone home, if we had reported accurately, if the Council had been given the true picture of what was growing in Sector 7 Gamma and had made a considered decision based on reality rather than assumption. Then perhaps none of what followed would have happened. But I was Fleet Second Drevath Kyle Sunori of the Sarathi Dominion, and we had never lost a war. And what Varessa Holt was describing was a planet of 8 billion beings who had not yet successfully left their own solar system. And I looked at the hologram of that bright blue marble and I thought, they are remarkable, but they are small.
They are growing, but they are contained. We have time. I said, "We proceed with the assessment, we make contact, we establish terms, we catalogue the system's resources, and we return with a full picture. That is what the Council authorized, and that is what we will deliver." Holt said, "Understood, Fleet Second." She stood and left. She did not say, "I told you so," or "I was right," or any variation of those things in all the months and years that followed, even when she had every right to. That, I think, is a mark of a character better than my own. We began our approach to Earth on the 17th day. We did not know, I did not know, that humanity had been watching us since day 3. We learned this afterward. I want to be precise about when we learned it, because the sequence matters. We did not learn it when we made contact. We did not learn it in the first days of negotiation. We learned it much, much later, when a human officer sat across a table from me and, without any apparent desire to humiliate me, simply told me the truth because I had asked a direct question, and she believed direct questions deserved direct answers. She said, "Your ships have a thermal signature that our deep space monitoring network detected on day 3 of your presence in system. We have been tracking you since then." I said, "You have a deep space monitoring network." She said, "We have several. They serve different purposes. The one that detected you is primarily designed to give us warning of large asteroid or comet trajectories that might threaten Earth. But it works equally well for ships." I said, "The survey probe found no evidence of such a network 17 years ago." She said, "No, we built it in the last 9 years." There was a long pause in which I processed this, and she waited, patient and quiet, for me to finish. I said, "And what did you do when you detected us?" She said, "We informed our governments. We began developing contingency plans. We had a significant internal debate about whether to make contact ourselves or wait for you to announce your presence. We decided to wait, primarily because we wanted to understand your intentions before committing to any particular posture." She paused, then added, "Also, frankly, because watching how an unknown species behaves when it thinks no one is watching tells you considerably more about that species than what it says when it knows it has an audience. I said, and what did watching us tell you? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, it told us you were cautious and professional, which was reassuring. It told us you were probably operating under orders from a larger authority, which was important context. And it told us that your ships, while impressive by the standards we were familiar with, had several exploitable technical characteristics that our engineers found very interesting.
She said this last part in the same calm, informative tone with which she had said everything else, as though it were simply another data point, as though the words exploitable technical characteristics were not, in any meaningful sense, a statement of threat. I did not ask her to elaborate on that point. I should have, but I was still, at that stage, operating under a framework in which the relative positions of our civilizations were clear to me, even if the details were proving more complicated than expected. I was the representative of an 11th century empire. She was a military officer from a planet that had not yet left its own solar system in significant numbers. Or so I believed. Part 4. Contact. We announced our presence on the 18th day. Standard Sorathi First Contact Protocol, a broad-spectrum signal transmission in the target species' dominant communication formats, carrying a mathematical greeting sequence, followed by what our translation division had prepared as a basic message of introduction. We identified ourselves as the Sorathi Dominion. We described our civilization in terms calculated to convey scale and advancement without specific threat. We expressed interest in communication, and what our diplomatic texts called productive engagement, a phrase that in practice meant, we intend to assess your civilization for potential integration into the Dominion's resource and strategic framework, and we would prefer this process to be orderly. We received a response in 4 hours and 17 minutes. 4 hours and 17 minutes. The signal transit time from our position to Earth and back was approximately 40 minutes at light speed, which meant the humans had received our transmission, assembled a response, and transmitted it within approximately 3.5 hours of first contact with an alien civilization. I had conducted 11 previous first contacts. The fastest previous response time had been 9 hours. Most species took days. A few had taken weeks, paralyzed by the enormity of the moment. The human response was video. 2 individuals on what appeared to be a government facility, seated at a formal table. One was in civilian clothing, a tall man with graying temples and calm dark eyes, who introduced himself as the Secretary General of a body called the United Nations, an organization he described as representing the collective nations of Earth. The other was in military uniform, a woman of middle age with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular stillness of someone who has spent a long time learning to appear at ease in high-stakes situations. She introduced herself as Admiral Chen Wei-Lin, representing what she called Earth's Unified Defense Coordination, an organization, I later discovered, that had been in existence for precisely 11 days at the time of first contact, created specifically and hastily in the days between when humanity detected us and when we announced ourselves. The Secretary General's message, translated by our division, was as follows. On behalf of the people of Earth, we welcome your communication. We have been aware of your presence in our solar system for some time, and we have been preparing for this moment with great care. We are a young civilization by any standard you likely apply, and we are under no illusion that the vessel approaching our planet does not represent capabilities far beyond our own. Nevertheless, we wish to open this conversation as equals in good faith, because we believe that good faith is not a function of relative power. It is a function of character. We are prepared to talk. We hope you are as well. I watched this transmission 3 times. I was trying to locate in those words the thing that was bothering me about them. They were not threatening. They were not defensive. They were not the elaborate declarations of importance that most pre-space civilizations produced on first contact. The long lists of cultural and historical achievements, the puffery of species pride, the gestures towards strength that species with no real strength invariably made. There was none of that. There was just, "We know you're here. We've been thinking about this. Let's talk." And the line that kept stopping me, "Good faith is not a function of relative power. It is a function of character." Fleet Third Holt, standing at my shoulder as I reviewed the transmission, said quietly, "They knew we were here. They had 11 days. What do you think they did with 11 days? I said, "Prepared contingency plans," as they said. She said, "What kind of contingency plans does a pre-space civilization have for an alien fleet?" I did not have an answer to that question. It seemed at the time almost academic. The contingency plans of a civilization that had not yet left its own solar system, against an 11-ship fleet representing a 2,000-year-old empire. What could those plans realistically encompass? I was about to find out. I led the contact delegation personally. This was not standard protocol. The fleet second of an assessment mission typically sent a diplomatic envoy while remaining with the fleet. But something about this contact felt different in a way I could not articulate and could not therefore formally justify as a reason to deviate. So I deviated without articulating it, and Holt said nothing, which I understood to mean she agreed. We descended in a single shuttle, myself and 4 others, Holt, Teth Aaron, our chief diplomatic officer Serath Vel, and a security officer whose name I will not record here because what happened to him later is something I still carry with some guilt. They met us on the surface of what they called Geneva, Switzerland, a small nation that humans had designated by historical convention as a neutral site for significant negotiations. The city was beautiful in a way our briefing materials had not conveyed. Old stone buildings alongside modern glass structures, mountains visible in the distance, a lake the color of polished steel under a sky that was, that particular morning, the precise blue of deep water. I stepped out of the shuttle and stood on Earth for the first time and breathed air that no Sarathi had ever breathed, and I was aware, in a way that surprised me, that this was not a small thing. They were waiting for us outside a long, low building. The Secretary General, the Admiral, and a group of perhaps 30 others, diplomats, advisors, analysts, and 3 individuals whose function I did not immediately identify, but whose eyes moved constantly, cataloging everything, missing nothing. I later learned these were intelligence officers. The distinction between intelligence officers and analysts was not in human culture always immediately obvious from presentation. That was, I came to understand, deliberate. The Secretary General walked forward and extended his right hand. Our briefing materials had described this gesture. A physical handshake, an ancient human greeting signifying peaceful intent, the open palm demonstrating no concealed weapon. I extended my own hand. His grip was firm and brief and warm. His eyes, meeting mine, were steady and curious without being aggressive. He said, "Fleet Second Sunori, welcome to Earth. I hope the journey was comfortable." The politeness was genuine. That was the first thing I learned about humans in person. They were genuinely polite, not performatively polite. The distinction is significant. Performative politeness is a tool. Genuine politeness is a discipline, something that has to be practiced and maintained even when, perhaps especially when, it requires considerable effort. This man knew what I represented. He knew the fleet in orbit above his planet. He knew the history of what the Sarathi Dominion had done to other civilizations in his exact position. And he was asking me if the journey had been comfortable. I said, "The journey was long but uneventful. Thank you for receiving us." He said, "Thank you for coming in person. It tells us something that we appreciate." And then he stepped aside, and the Admiral, Chen Wei-Lin, stepped forward, and she did not extend her hand. She stood at a distance that was precise and considered and said, "Fleet Second, Admiral Chen Wei-Lin, I command Earth's Defense Coordination. I'd like to speak with you directly at some point about operational matters, if that's appropriate." I said, "Of course." She nodded and stepped back, and her eyes, which had been completely still on mine for those few seconds, went back to their quiet cataloguing of everything around her. I had the distinct impression that she had, in that brief exchange, gathered more information about me than I had gathered about her. Part 5. What they asked and what they didn't. The first formal session lasted 6 hours. We sat at a long table in a room with high windows and afternoon light moving slowly across the floor, and we talked. Or more precisely, they asked questions, and I answered them, and only gradually did I begin to feel the cumulative weight of what they were learning and what they were revealing through the very precision of their inquiry. The Secretary-General, whose name was Kofi Mensah, and who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service before reaching his current position, asked mostly about the Dominion structure and governance. How were decisions made?
What was the relationship between the Council and the fleet? What role did species other than the Sarathi themselves play in the Dominion's governing bodies? His questions were careful and thorough, and built on each other in a way that suggested he was constructing a detailed architectural model of our civilization in real time as I spoke. He asked, of the 17 species that submitted to integration, do any of them hold seats on the Council? I said, 2 hold advisory positions. He said, advisory, not voting. I said, voting membership in the Council is reserved for Sarathi citizens. He said, and the other 15, the ones who submitted but don't hold advisory positions. I said, they participate in the Dominion's administrative and economic structures at various levels. He said, but not in governance? I said, not directly, no. He nodded slowly and made a note and moved on to the next question, and I noticed that he had not expressed an opinion about any of what I had described. He had simply received the information and recorded it and continued. The questions he was not asking were as revealing as the ones he was. He was not asking, is that fair? He was not asking, do those species resent their exclusion? He was not asking, what happens to a species that chooses not to submit to integration? He already knew the answers to those questions. He was simply confirming the details. The Admiral, Chen Wei-lin, spoke less in the first session. When she spoke, her questions were shorter and more specific. She asked about fleet composition and standard patrol ranges. She asked about the Dominion's communication infrastructure and latency. She asked about the assessment mission's authorization structure. Specifically, at what level of the Council hierarchy a decision about Earth's status would be made, and on what timeline. These were, I realized, the questions of someone who was constructing not an architectural model of our civilization, but a strategic operational picture. She was asking what she needed to know to answer the question, what are our options, and how long do we have to exercise them? She asked, Fleet Second, when does the Dominion Council expect your assessment report? I said, we have a standard reporting window of 120 days from initial contact. She said, and after the report is submitted, what is the typical decision timeline for an integration assessment? I said, it varies. Typically 3 to 6 months from report submission, depending on Council workload. She said, so from today, we have approximately 9 to 10 months before the Council makes a decision about Earth status. I said, that is approximately correct. She made a single note and said, thank you. That's helpful. The tone of her voice was entirely neutral. She might have been noting a meeting time. She was, I understood later, noting the window within which humanity had to make itself into something the Dominion could not simply integrate. 9 to 10 months. I had just handed Admiral Chen Wei-lin a deadline. I did not understand in that moment what a human being can do with a deadline. I would learn. At the end of the first session, as we were preparing to break for the evening, the Secretary-General said something that stayed with me through the night. He said, Fleet Second, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is more useful than performance at this stage. I said, please. He said, we are not naive about our situation. We understand that the Dominion's presence here is not simply a courtesy call. We understand that the history of your civilization's interactions with species in our position suggests a limited range of outcomes.
We are not frightened by that history, or rather, we are frightened because fear is a reasonable response to accurate information. But we are not paralyzed by it. And I want you to know that whatever happens in these discussions, whatever the Council ultimately decides, we intend to be exactly what we have presented ourselves as, a civilization that operates in good faith even when good faith is not advantageous. Not because we are idealists, but because we have found, over a very long and very bloody history of our own, that it is ultimately the most effective strategy. I said, "You present good faith as a strategy." He said, "I present it as both, a value and a strategy. The two don't have to be in conflict." I went back to the shuttle that evening and sat in the quiet of its interior and thought about that, and about the Admiral's careful note about 9 to 10 months, and about the way Holt had asked, what kind of contingency plans does a pre-space civilization have for an alien fleet? And I thought, for the first time seriously and with some unease, that I might not know the answer to that question as well as I assumed. Part 6. What grows in the dark. The negotiations continued for 47 days. I use the word negotiations loosely, because for most of that period, what was actually happening was something more like a long, structured conversation between two parties who both understood that the real decisions were not being made at the table. The Sarathi Dominion's decisions were being made 11 ships away in orbit, and eventually at a council chamber on a world 63 light days distant. Humanity's decisions were being made everywhere simultaneously, which was itself one of the things I was slowest to understand about them. I met daily with the Secretary-General and his team. I met 3 times a week with Admiral Chen. I toured a human university, a research facility, a manufacturing complex, and a space launch center, guided by attentive hosts who answered every question I asked directly and completely, and volunteered no information I hadn't requested. I sat in on a session of the United Nations General Assembly, watching the representatives of nearly 200 separate nation-states debate and argue and vote, and I noted that the debate was genuine. These were not performances staged for my benefit, and that the outcomes were, by any measure, chaotic and slow and frequently unsatisfying to most of the participants, and yet the system continued to function, because they were all, despite the chaos, participating in it. Serath Vel, my diplomatic officer, described it as beautiful inefficiency, and meant it as an observation rather than a criticism. She said, "They make decisions badly and slowly, and through enormous conflict, and then they implement the decisions they make with extraordinary commitment. It is as though the difficulty of the decision-making process itself creates investment in the outcome." I said, "You find that admirable?" She said, "I find it functional in ways that our more efficient systems are not. We make decisions quickly and cleanly, and then the individuals who didn't participate in the decision implement it with whatever investment they choose to bring, which is sometimes considerable and sometimes, especially in long occupation situations, very little. They make decisions slowly and painfully, and then everyone who participated in the pain of making it has a reason to make it work." I filed that observation alongside the one about chaotic multi-directional development being an accelerant. I was collecting a set of observations about humanity that did not yet form a coherent picture, but whose individual pieces were each, in isolation, unsettling in a quiet way. On the 22nd day, Admiral Chen asked to see me privately, outside the formal session structure. We met at dawn, their dawn, the sun rising over the lake and painting everything gold and pink in a way that was almost aggressively beautiful, and walked along the shore without security on either side, just the two of us and the water and the light. She said, "I want to show you something, and I want you to understand that I am showing you this deliberately and transparently, and that the showing of it is itself a message, not a concealment." I said, "What are you showing me?" She held out a data device of human manufacture, a flat light object, and showed me what was on its display, a map. Or, more precisely, an expansion of what I had understood to be Earth's space infrastructure, with annotations and dates attached to each element. The orbital station I knew about, the lunar base I knew about, the asteroid belt mining installations I knew about. But there were other things on this map that I had not detected and had not been told about. A second orbital structure, partially constructed, in a higher orbit. 3 additional lunar installations in construction phases. A network of installations distributed through the inner solar system. Propulsion experiments, she said in answer to my unasked question, that were not yet operational, but were close. And the numbers beside the dates. These had not been built over years. Most of them had been built or accelerated in the 11 days between when humanity detected our fleet and when we announced our presence. I said, "You built these in 11 days?" She said no. We had pre-positioned manufacturing capability and staged components. The decisions to activate and accelerate had been contingency planned before your arrival. When we detected your fleet, we executed those plans. I said, "You had contingency plans for alien contact that included infrastructure acceleration protocols." She said, "We have contingency plans for most things. It's something of a cultural habit." She said this without any pride in her voice, as though it was simply a fact about weather patterns. Then she said, "I'm showing you this because I want the conversation between our civilizations to be based on accurate information about what Earth actually is, rather than what our survey data from 17 years ago suggested it was. I think decisions made on accurate information produce better outcomes than decisions made on outdated assumptions." I said, "And the decision the Dominion Council will make about Earth's status, you want that decision to be based on accurate information?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Even if the accurate information suggests Earth is more developed than the Council assumed?" She said, "Especially then." She paused. "Fleet Second, I am going to be direct with you because I think you are someone who responds well to directness, and because we don't have time for anything else. The Dominion has options regarding Earth. Integration, relocation, resolution. I know your history, and I know those words. I am not naive about the weight of this conversation, but I want you to understand something. Whatever decision the Council makes will be based on an assessment you provide, and the assessment you provide will reflect what you actually found here. I am asking you, not demanding, asking, to find out what is actually here before you write that assessment." I said, "What are you suggesting I will find?" She looked at the lake for a long moment, and then looked back at me and said, "I'm suggesting you haven't looked yet. Not really. You've seen what we've shown you. You haven't seen what we haven't. You haven't looked yet. Not really." Those words stayed with me longer than anything else from those 47 days. Because she was right. And I almost didn't listen. Part 7. The Thing Under the Water. I went back to the fleet and spent 3 days reviewing everything we had detected from orbit. I asked Teth Aaron to conduct a full-spectrum active scan, the kind we typically reserved for hostile engagements, because it announced our presence unmistakably, but which produced detailed intelligence that passive observation could not match. I told him I had the host civilization's implicit permission, which was not entirely accurate, but was close enough to true that I did not lose sleep over it. The results came back on the 3rd day. Teth Aaron brought them to me personally, which he had never done before in 9 years of working together. He brought them in hard copy, a physical printout, which he also never did, and he set them on my desk and stood back and said, "Fleet Second, I need you to review this carefully." I reviewed it carefully. What the active scan revealed, which passive observation had missed. The second orbital structure I had seen on Chen Weilin's map was not a habitat station. It was, and our analysis team spent 2 days arguing about this before arriving at consensus, a weapons platform. Not of any design we recognized because it was not Sarathi, not any technology we had encountered in 41 first contacts. It was human technology, which meant it was technology they had developed themselves, without reference to any external template, in the time between their first serious engagement with rocketry and now. The platform was not complete.
but the weapon systems visible on its partially constructed frame were substantial. The power signatures suggested something considerably more powerful than the orbital launch facilities we had catalogued. There were 4 others in various stages of construction at different orbital inclinations, positioned to provide coverage of different approach vectors. 5 orbital weapons platforms being built in parallel by a civilization that had not yet left its own solar system in significant numbers. And beneath the surface of their planet, scattered across all major continental landmasses, signatures consistent with underground installations of considerable scale. Power generation well above what the surface infrastructure accounted for. Not military installations, or not exclusively military. Manufacturing, research. Something our analysis team flagged with the notation. Consistent with distributed civilization preservation infrastructure. I asked what that meant.
The analyst said, "It means they have built, underground and out of orbital observation site, the capability to survive and continue as a civilization even if everything on the surface were destroyed. Distributed manufacturing, distributed food production, distributed data storage and communication. It is, in our terminology, a continuity of civilization system. The Dominion has something similar, but ours was built over 3 centuries. These signatures suggest human construction timelines of approximately," she paused, "12 to 15 years. I said, "They built a continuity of civilization system in 12 to 15 years. She said, "The construction timelines on the power signatures suggest so. Though some elements may be older, it's difficult to date precisely from orbital scan." I said, "Why would a civilization that has not yet faced an existential threat build a continuity system?" She said, "We don't know. But fleet second, they have faced existential threats, multiple times, internal ones, wars, climate events, resource crises. They have come close to self-termination several times in their recorded history. Perhaps the experience of near self-termination makes a species build differently than a civilization that has not had that experience." I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Holt and told her what the scan had found, and she listened without interrupting. And when I was done, she said, "Do you remember what I said on day 16? I said, "You said we should go home and report what we actually found." She said, "We are still not doing that." I said, "No, but we are getting closer to understanding what we actually found." I went back to the surface and asked to see Admiral Chen privately again. She received me in a small office in the same building where the formal sessions were held, a room with bookshelves on 3 walls, actual physical books with spines worn from use, and a window that looked out at the mountains. I said, "I conducted a full-spectrum active scan of your planet and solar system." She said, "I know. We detected it." I said, "The orbital platforms." She said, "Yes." I said, "The underground infrastructure." She said, "Yes." I said, "How long have you been building all of this?" She said, "The weapons platforms, formally, for about 4 years. The underground infrastructure in various forms, for about 15. We accelerated significantly after SETI, that's our search for extraterrestrial intelligence program, began detecting consistent anomalies in the outer solar system that we couldn't attribute to natural phenomena. That was about 12 years ago. We accelerated further when we identified your probe's return signal trajectory 7 years ago. I said, "You identified the probe's return signal?" She said, "We traced it. Took us 2 years of analysis. We had a rough directional vector, not a precise location, but we knew approximately where your civilization was, and we knew approximately when you would come back, because the probe's data collection pattern suggested an assessment function rather than simple survey. We knew this would not be the end of the contact." I said nothing for a long moment. Outside the window, the mountains sat in the afternoon light, with the total indifference of very old things. I said, "You have known for 7 years that we were coming." She said, "We suspected for 7 years. We confirmed when we detected your fleet. But yes, 7 years of preparation based on informed suspicion." I said, "And in 7 years,
She said, "In 7 years we built what you found, and what you haven't found yet." That last sentence sat in the room between us for a long time. I said, "What haven't I found yet?" She said, "Fleet Second, I have been honest with you throughout these sessions because I believe it's the right approach, and because, frankly, I think you are the kind of person who can do something useful with honesty. So I'm going to tell you something that I hope you will take back to your council and present accurately, not as a threat, as information." I said, "Tell me." She said, "Your active scan found our inner system infrastructure. It did not find our outer system infrastructure, because it is built specifically to avoid detection by scanning methodologies like the one you used. We chose those methodologies deliberately, based on our analysis of your probe's sensor package. What is out there, in the asteroid belt, in the outer planetary system, around several of the outer moons, is significantly more extensive than what you found, and it has been building quietly and continuously for the past 6 years. I said, "What is it?" She said, "Ships, primarily ships, also production facilities to build more ships, also autonomous defense systems, positioned at multiple solar system approach vectors, that activate on contact with any vessel not carrying an Earth identification signal." I said, "How many ships?" She said, "As of this morning, 412 operational vessels of various classes, approximately 200 more in various stages of construction and commissioning." The room was very quiet. The mountains outside the window did not move. I said, 412. She said, "And rising. Our production rate has increased since we confirmed your arrival." Part 8. The weight of the number. I returned to the Vathara that evening and did something I had not done since my first command, 20 years earlier. I sat on the floor of my quarters. Not in a chair, on the floor. I'm not entirely sure why. I think perhaps the floor felt more real than the chair, and I needed something real in that moment. I had 11 ships. 412 human vessels were operational, with 200 more in construction, and the production rate was rising, against our 11 assessment ships, of which 3 were survey craft not designed for combat. The Sarathi Dominion had a full war fleet of approximately 12,000 vessels distributed across 22 star systems, but that fleet was not here. What was here were my 11 ships. And the transit time from the nearest Sarathi fleet concentration to this system was, I did my calculation twice because I wanted to be wrong, 63 days. 63 days. In 63 days, if I sent a signal home immediately, and a fleet departed immediately, reinforcement could arrive. But we could not maintain orbit against 412 vessels for 63 days, even assuming those vessels were significantly inferior to ours in individual capability, which I was no longer comfortable assuming. I called Holt to my quarters. She came in and saw me on the floor and sat down on the floor across from me without comment, because she was, as I have said, a better person than I am. I told her what Chen had told me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, 412. I said, "And rising." She said, "Fleet Second. I need to ask you a direct question, and I need you to answer it directly." I said, "Ask." She said, "Did she tell you this to threaten us?" I thought about this carefully. I thought about the tone of Chen's voice, the absolute absence of triumph in it, the quiet, informative delivery, the same as always, the same careful calibration of directness and restraint that had characterized every interaction I had with her. She had not leaned forward when she told me. She had not watched my face for a reaction. She had delivered the information and then waited, patiently, as she always waited. I said, "No." She told me because she thinks it's important for the Council's decision to be made on accurate information. She believes that a decision made on the assumption that Earth is a defenseless pre-space civilization will produce a different outcome than a decision made on the knowledge of what Earth actually is. And she wants the outcome that accurate information produces, because she has calculated that it is better for Earth. Holt said,
Or she told us because she wanted us to know we cannot win a fight here, and knowing that prevents a fight here, which is also better for Earth. I said, both of those things can be true simultaneously. Holt said, yes, they can. She paused. How did they do it? 400 ships. 6 years. How did they do it? I thought about everything I had observed and collected and filed. The chaotic multi-directional development, the competition accelerating pace, the private enterprise building alongside government programs, the 17 nations launching to orbit, the United Nations General Assembly, hundreds of voices in conflict, all somehow continuing to function. The underground infrastructure built to ensure civilization continued, even if everything above ground was destroyed. The contingency plans that had been ready to execute the moment our fleet was detected. The 11 days between detection and our announcement, during which they had accelerated every construction program they had, because they had already planned exactly what to do if this day came, and all they needed was the signal to start. I said, they were terrified, and they built their fear into engines. Holt looked at me. I said, everything they have built, the stations, the weapons platforms, the underground infrastructure, the ships, all of it, comes from a civilization that has spent its entire recorded history on the edge of termination. Wars, plagues, climate collapse, resource exhaustion. They have been almost destroyed so many times that building survival infrastructure became cultural reflex. They don't build shelters because they expect a specific threat. They build shelters because they cannot imagine not building them. And when they identified a specific threat, us, they simply directed that existing reflex at us, and they had 7 years and 8 billion people and the accumulated manufacturing and engineering capability of a species that has been solving survival problems continuously for 10,000 years. Holt was quiet for a long time. Then she said, they were supposed to be pre-space. I said, they are pre-space. That's the thing. They reach their own moon in small numbers. They have a station. They have some mining operations. By the standard Sarathi metrics, they are pre-space. But the metrics don't account for a civilization that was already doing most of the hard work before they had the space to do it in. The hard work is the engineering capacity, the industrial base, the institutional knowledge for complex coordinated construction. They had all of that already applied to other problems. When they turned it towards space, they were not starting from scratch. They were redirecting a fully developed capability set to a new application. Holt said, and we assess them by their visible output, not by the capability generating the output. I said, we assess them by 17-year-old data about their visible output. Yes. We had made the most fundamental error an assessor can make. We had looked at what a civilization had done and forgotten to ask what it was capable of doing. Part 9. The conversation that changed everything. On the 39th day, I asked Admiral Chen Wei-lin a question I had been carrying since the first session. I asked it because we were nearing the end of the formal assessment period, and I needed to write a report for the Council, and the question was the center of the report, and I had been afraid to ask it, because I was not certain I wanted the honest answer. We were walking again, this time not along the lakeshore but through a section of the city. Old streets, cobblestones, buildings several centuries old, and the afternoon light was long and golden on the stone, and there was nothing around us that felt threatening or military or even particularly consequential, and perhaps that was why I finally asked. I said, if the Council's decision is integration, standard Sarathi integration terms, what happens? She walked for a few steps before answering. She said, define integration terms for me precisely. I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing. I said, administrative incorporation into the Dominion structure. Earth's resources and production capacity directed by Dominion planning. Your governing institutions dissolved and replaced by Dominion provincial administration. Your military forces absorbed into Dominion auxiliary structure. Cultural and social systems permitted to continue in non-governance spheres. She said, "You dissolve our governments, take our resources, absorb our military, and let us keep our music and our food." I said, "Approximately. Yes." She was quiet for 2 full blocks of cobblestone. Then she said, "Fleet second, I'm going to answer your question honestly because I think that's more useful than a diplomatic answer. If the Council decides on integration under those terms, there will be a war." I said, "Earth has 400 ships. The Dominion has 12,000. She said, "Yes. And you will win. Eventually. But I want you to understand something about what that war will look like, so that whatever you write in your report accurately reflects what the Council is choosing, if they choose military integration." She stopped walking. We were standing in the middle of a cobblestone square, old fountain in the center, pigeons on the ledges of old buildings, and she turned and looked at me with the same absolute stillness she always had and said, "We will not surrender." I want to be precise about this. Not, "We are unlikely to surrender," or "significant elements of Earth's population will resist." We will not surrender, not as a government policy, but as a cultural fact. You will defeat our fleet, probably in weeks, possibly in days. I am realistic about the capability differential. You will then have to take Earth. To take Earth, you will have to fight for every continent, every nation, every city, every neighborhood, every building. We have 8 billion people, and a very, very long history of deciding that certain things are worth dying for. You will take years, possibly decades, and when you have finished, what you will have is a planet of people who have decided that you are the thing worth dying for them to fight against, and they will fight you until there is nothing left to fight with. We have done this to each other, among our own nations, for our entire history. We know how. Your administrative apparatus will be attacked continuously. Your replacement systems will be subverted. Your resource extraction will be disrupted. Your communication systems will be compromised. And everything we built underground, everything in the outer system that you haven't found, that will keep building, for as long as there is a single human being with the capability and the will to build something, which will be a very long time. She stopped. Pigeons moved on the ledges. Somewhere in the city, children were making the particular kind of noise that children make when they are playing, and their primary concern is the game rather than anything else in the world. She said, "I'm not threatening you, I'm informing you. The outcome of military integration is not the productive administrative arrangement your council is probably modeling. It is a war that costs you more than you can gain from winning it. I am telling you this so that whoever writes the report and whoever reads it understands the actual cost-benefit of the decision they're making." I said, "And if the council decides on a different arrangement?" She said, "Then we would like to propose one. Secretary General Mensah has a proposal that I think your council would find genuinely interesting, if they are willing to consider an arrangement that doesn't have a historical precedent in Dominion structure." I said, "What kind of arrangement?" She said, "A partnership. Not integration, not submission, not relocation. A genuine partnership between the Dominion and Earth, with defined mutual obligations, shared decision-making in areas of common interest, and preserve sovereignty in areas that are not. We would have things to offer the Dominion. Our industrial capacity is considerable and growing. Our engineering approaches have produced some technical innovations that we believe would be genuinely valuable to a 12,000-year-old civilization. And we would receive from the Dominion knowledge, access to the broader galaxy, and the security of a formal relationship rather than the uncertainty of an undefined one." I said, "The Dominion has never entered into a partnership arrangement with a species it assessed for integration." She said, "I know." She paused. It would be a first. She said this without irony, without triumph, simply as a fact. Then she said, "Most civilizations you assessed were not what Earth is. We are aware that we are an unusual case. We are asking the Council to consider that an unusual case deserves an unusual response." That evening I sat in my quarters for a long time and thought about the 41 species the Dominion had encountered. I thought about the 17 that submitted, and the 14 that were absorbed, and the 7 that were relocated,
and the 3 that were resolved. I thought about what those words meant when you removed the bureaucratic softening and looked at the actual events they described. I thought about the 2 advisory seats on the council and what it meant to have an advisory seat versus a voting seat, and whether the species occupying those seats felt the distinction as keenly as I was beginning to feel it now. I thought about the Terthari councillor who had said, at the original vote, "The fact that they are still here is itself unusual. Most species at this stage are self-terminating." And I thought about Admiral Chen's flat, informative voice saying, "We will not surrender, not as a government policy, as a cultural fact." And I thought about the mountains outside the window, and the cobblestone square, and the children playing, and a species that had been almost destroying itself for 10,000 years and had never quite managed to finish the job, because something in them, something that generated 400 ships in 6 years from nothing but fear and industrial reflex and the absolute unwillingness to accept that this was how it ended, kept reaching, kept building, kept finding the next thing to survive. I wrote 3 different versions of the assessment report that night. I deleted 2 of them. The 3rd one I kept. Part 10. Aliens came to conquer Earth. What I have not told you yet is what happened on the 44th day, 3 days before the formal assessment period ended. I have not told it because telling it requires me to be honest about my own failure in a way that is not easy, and because the events of that day, not the negotiation, not the political architecture of what followed, but what happened on the 44th day, are the thing I think about most often in the years since. Sub-Commander Vel Rath made a decision. He made it without my authorization, without Holt's knowledge, without consultation with any of the senior staff. He made it, as best I can reconstruct from the records and from what he told me afterward, because he had decided independently that the negotiation was going in the wrong direction, and that the assessment report I was preparing was a capitulation rather than a professional military judgment, and that someone needed to take action that reset the situation on terms more favorable to the Dominion. He was, in his own lights, trying to help. I want to say that clearly, because what followed is terrible enough without adding contempt for his intentions to it. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but he acted from something he believed was loyalty and duty. He took the patrol vessel Keth Solar out of formation on a supposed maintenance repositioning exercise, and he broke our agreed signal blackout with Earth, and he sent a transmission to the planet below. The transmission was in the Sorathi official protocol format, and it identified itself as coming from the senior command authority of the 9th Expansion Arm, which was a lie. It was coming from a sub-commander with no such authority, and it said, in formal Dominion terms, that the assessment period had concluded and the Sorathi Dominion had decided to proceed with standard integration, and that Earth's governments were instructed to begin preparing for administrative transition, and that resistance would be met with appropriate force. He sent this transmission at 0342 hours, local time in Geneva. It was received on Earth at 0343 hours. I was asleep. Holt was asleep. Rath had transmitted and returned the Keth Solar to formation before anyone on the Vithara realized what had happened. I found out at 0417 hours, when my communication officer woke me. She said, "Fleet Second, we have received an urgent communication from the surface, and Sub-Commander Rath's personal log shows a 1-minute gap that does not correspond to any authorized transmission record." I understood what had happened before she finished the sentence. The communication from the surface was not from the Secretary General. It was from Admiral Chen Wei-Lin. It was brief. It said, "Fleet Second Sonori, we have received a transmission purporting to be from your command authority announcing integration proceedings. I am reaching out to you directly and immediately because I assume this transmission was either unauthorized or there has been a miscommunication. I hope it was one of those things. Please advise immediately. We have contingency systems that activate automatically in response to a communication of this nature, and I am currently holding those systems in manual suspension. I can hold manual suspension for approximately 40 minutes. 40 minutes. I was dressed and at the communication console in 4 minutes. I transmitted directly to Chen's personal communication device,
We had exchanged direct channels on the second day of negotiations, and I said, "Admiral, this transmission was not authorized. I repeat, not authorized. It was sent by a junior officer without my knowledge or approval and does not represent the Dominion's position. I am taking immediate action within my fleet to address this. Please maintain manual suspension of your contingency systems. The assessment is ongoing. Nothing has changed." There was a silence of approximately 3 minutes, during which I sat at the console and felt something I had not felt since I was very young. A kind of fear that has nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with the possibility of having destroyed something that cannot be unbuilt. Then Chen's voice came back and she said, "Understood, Fleet Second. Manual suspension maintained."
I appreciate the immediate clarification. Please understand that what you just prevented required me to override 6 automated systems and direct 3 separate command chains to stand down. I want you to understand that, because I want you to understand the margin we were operating in. We were closer to a very bad outcome than I think either of us would like. I said, "I understand. I am deeply sorry for the miscommunication and the breach of trust. I will provide you with a full account of what happened as soon as I have completed my internal investigation. And I want you to know, the officer responsible will be held to account under Sarathi military law." She said, "I appreciate that." Then she said, "Fleet Second, what would have happened if you had not been reachable? If this had come from a higher authority or from a position of genuine command?" I said, "Those contingency systems, what are they?" There was a pause. Then she said, "I told you there was outer system infrastructure you hadn't found. If the integration transmission had been genuine, or if I had not been able to reach you and confirm it wasn't, those systems would have activated within 40 minutes of the transmission. All of them, simultaneously. The Keth Solar, the vessel that sent the unauthorized transmission, would have been the first target because its signal could be precisely located. The rest of your fleet would have followed. Not because we want to fight, Fleet Second. Because a civilization that builds for survival understands that the moment of maximum danger is the first moment when the other side believes they have decided and you have not yet responded. If we are going to fight, we fight then, when surprise is still possible. We do not wait to fight after integration has begun, because fighting after integration has begun is what we spent 7 years building infrastructure to avoid having to do. I sat with that for a very long time. I thought about the 412 ships, and the outer system infrastructure I hadn't found, and the automated systems positioned at multiple approach vectors, and the contingency plans that had been ready to execute for 7 years, and I understood, fully and finally, and with a clarity that I do not think I had allowed myself before that moment, what humanity had built in the space between our probe's visit and our fleet's arrival. They had not built a defense. They had built a trap. An enormous, patient, absolutely invisible trap, designed to spring in the first 40 minutes of a conflict, before a Sarathi fleet could organize a response in a way that would eliminate the threat in the system before reinforcement could arrive. And they had built it, not because they were aggressive, but because they were, as I had observed from their transmissions during transit, very, very good at survival. Aliens came to conquer Earth. We never told them what Earth had become while they were on their way. I dealt with Wrath. That process was not pleasant, and I will not describe it in detail. He was confined, processed under military law, and would face the Council's judicial authority when we returned home. He understood by the end of our conversation what he had almost done, and the understanding did not make him a better person, or make me feel better about my own failures of oversight that had permitted him to reach that decision unchecked. That is the nature of certain kinds of mistakes. The damage they do to the person who caused them is, in some ways, a proportionate part of the cost. Part 11. What the report said. The assessment report I submitted to the Sarathi Dominion Council, transmitted on the 47th day, was the longest assessment document in the 9th Expansion Arm's history. It was also the first assessment document in that history to include a recommendation other than one of the standard 4 categories: submit, absorb, relocate, or resolve. I recommended partnership. I submitted the full technical findings.
The orbital platforms, the underground infrastructure, the 412 vessels, and the construction pipeline, the outer system infrastructure, whose full scope we had confirmed only partially, the contingency systems, the production acceleration rate, the development curve that did not fit the standard model. I presented these not as arguments but as facts, documented, cross-referenced, sourced to specific observations by specific members of my team with their methodologies attached. And then I wrote the section that I knew would be the most controversial and the most important, which was not about infrastructure or ships or weapon systems at all. I wrote about the people. I wrote about the Secretary General's opening statement. Good faith is not a function of relative power, it is a function of character, and what it revealed about the value structure of human leadership. I wrote about the Admiral's steady, informative delivery of devastating information, her consistent choice of transparency over advantage, her maintenance of manual suspension on 6 automated systems during a 40-minute window when she had every justification for letting them run. I wrote about the United Nations session, the productive chaos of 200 voices in genuine conflict, arriving at genuine conclusions. I wrote about the people in the streets of Geneva, and the children playing in the square, and the books on the shelves of the Admiral's office, worn from actual use. I wrote, "This is a species that has not survived by being strong. It has survived by being unwilling to stop. The distinction is significant. A strong species survives challenges by overpowering them. A species that survives by refusing to stop builds different capabilities, distributed, redundant, autonomous, self-regenerating, that are, in the long run, more durable than strength. The Sarathi Dominion has encountered many strong species. We have not, in my assessment, previously encountered a species with this particular survival profile. The implications for how we approach this relationship deserve careful counsel attention." And I wrote, "The standard integration framework is not applicable to Earth. Not because the Dominion lacks the military capability to enforce integration. At scale, with full fleet commitment, the Dominion can certainly prevail. But because the cost of that prevailing, as I detail in Section 7, renders it strategically irrational. What Earth has built is specifically designed to make the first mover cost of military action prohibitive. It will continue to improve in that design indefinitely, because building things that ensure survival is what this species does when frightened, and we have given them 7 years of fear to work with. The trap we would be walking into grows more sophisticated and more lethal with every month of delay. In 12 months it will be worse than now. In 2 years, substantially worse. In 5 years, we will be looking at a civilization that has turned the same industrial and engineering capability that produced 400 ships in 6 years toward the explicit problem of defeating a Sarathi war fleet at scale, with the full knowledge of our capabilities derived from 7 years of studying our probe data. I am not recommending partnership because I am afraid. I am recommending partnership because it is the only rational option available, and because, having spent 47 days in the presence of these people, I believe it is also the right one." The Council took 93 days to respond. In those 93 days, my fleet remained in Earth orbit, and I remained on the surface more than aboard the Vethera, because there was nothing to do in orbit that was more useful than what I was doing on the surface, which was continuing to learn. I attended a concert, human orchestral music, performed by approximately 100 individuals using physical instruments in a great hall with thousands of listeners. I do not have the words in Sarathi for what that was. The closest I can come is organized feeling, which is not close at all. I sat in the audience and listened for 2 hours and understood, by the end, that I was listening to something that a species of 8 billion individuals had developed over thousands of years through the same chaotic, competitive, multi-directional process that had produced their space infrastructure, and that the result was, I will use the honest word, beautiful. Not impressive, beautiful. The distinction matters. Holt sat next to me at the concert, and at the end she said, "How do you write a war report about a species that produces this?" I said, "You write it honestly, and you hope the council is smart enough to see what the honesty is pointing at. She said, and if they're not? I said, then we come back here in a year and find a significantly more sophisticated trap and try to explain it again. The Secretary General joined us for the walk back from the concert hall. The night was cool, the city lit by its thousands of windows, and he asked what I had thought of the performance. I told him. He listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You know what always strikes me about that piece, the one in the second half, the Largo? It was composed by a man who was almost entirely deaf. He couldn't hear it. He wrote it from memory of sound and theoretical understanding of harmony. And somehow it is. Some people consider it the greatest thing our species has produced. An almost deaf man, late in his life, writing music he could not hear, for an audience he would never see, because the music needed to exist." I said, "Why are you telling me that?" He said, "Because I think it's the thing about us that's hardest to explain from the outside. We do things for reasons that don't have a clean, rational justification. We build things because they should exist. We create things because the creating matters even when the outcome is uncertain. And we fight for things, when we fight, for the same reason. Not because the calculation says we will win, because the thing is worth fighting for regardless of the calculation." He paused. "I wanted you to understand that before the council makes its decision. Whatever they decide, I want them to be deciding about the right thing. Not about our ships or our infrastructure or our contingency systems. About us." I said, "I included that in the report." He said, "I know. I read it." He said this without embarrassment, as though of course he had read it, and of course I would know he had read it, and of course that was fine. I said, "And?" He said, "I thought it was a very honest document. I hope it does what you need it to do." Part 12. What the Council said. The Council's response arrived on the 93rd day. I received it on the surface, in the small office where Chen had told me about the 400 ships, the mountains still visible through the window, unchanged and indifferent as they always were. I read it twice. Then I went to find Secretary General Mensah and Admiral Chen and told them I needed both of them in the same room. They gathered in the formal session chamber, just the three of us, the table that had hosted 47 days of careful conversation between two civilizations discovering each other. The afternoon light through the windows was the long golden light of late season, and everything was very quiet. I said, "The Council has reviewed the assessment report. There was considerable debate. The vote was 11-6 in favor of proceeding with partnership negotiations rather than integration proceedings." The Secretary General closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were bright, and his voice was steady, and he said, "Thank you, Fleet Second." Admiral Chen said nothing for a moment. Then she said, 11-6 is not unanimous." I said, "No." She said, "The 6 who voted against, what were they voting for?" I said, "Integration, technically." But the vote for integration was not a vote for military action. It was a vote to continue negotiating from a position of dominion superiority, rather than acknowledge mutual standing. The 6 are not, they are not, I want to be clear, voting to attack Earth. She said, "Not yet." I said, "Not yet." She nodded slowly. Then she said, 11-6. That's a margin. It means the partnership arrangement has to be good enough that the 6 don't have grounds to revisit the vote. She was not speaking to me now, or not only to me. She was thinking aloud, working through the implications with the focused efficiency I had come to recognize as her natural mode. She said, "The partnership terms need to make a compelling case on the Council's own terms. Economic benefit, strategic value, information access. Whatever the Dominion measures success by, the partnership needs to produce more of it than integration would. Not just for us. For them." She looked up. "Secretary General, the proposal you've had Mensah's team developing, how completed is it?" He said, "Ready to present whenever you are, Admiral." She said,
Present it tomorrow. She looked at me. Fleet second, can you stay another 60 days for the negotiation framework? I said, I can stay as long as necessary. She said, good. She paused, then said something that surprised me. How is your fleet?
60 days is a long time in orbit for ships designed for transit and assessment, not stationary deployment. I said, the crews are managing. It has been an unusual mission. She said, I can arrange shore leave rotations if that would help. Supervised, obviously, and we would need protocols, but your crews are people. They have been in orbit for 90 days. If they want to spend time on a planet, even an alien one, that option should be on the table. I looked at her. I realized, stopped being surprised by her, which was itself a kind of surprise. I said, I will ask Holt to coordinate with your liaison team on protocols. She said, good. The shore leave was extraordinary. I say this not to describe a pleasant event, but because what happened during those rotations produced some of the most useful intelligence about humanity that any Sarathi officer collected in the entire mission, and almost none of it was through formal observation. My crew went down to a planet that had been preparing for alien arrival for 7 years, and they found that the preparation had included, in a way that was very human and therefore completely impractical by Sarathi standards, trying to make the aliens feel welcome. Not strategically welcome, genuinely welcome. The cities they were taken to had guides who spoke Sarathi because humans had spent the previous months learning it from our probe's communication records, and not just guides, students, researchers, children who had decided that learning to speak to the alien visitors was important and interesting, and had simply begun doing so. My crew members found themselves, entirely without planning, in conversations with humans of all ages and descriptions who wanted to know what they ate, what they found beautiful, what their families were like, what they were afraid of, what made them laugh. Sarathi crews on assessment missions do not typically answer personal questions from subject populations. The assessment relationship is not a personal one. But these conversations were happening not in official contexts, but in markets and restaurants and public squares, and the humans asking were not asking strategically. They were asking because they wanted to know, because they were, by the most fundamental inclination of their nature, curious about other people, and my crew members had become, in the street-level geography of their experience, other people. Fleet Third Holt told me about coming back from her third surface rotation and being unable to file a tactical report because everything she had observed was personal rather than operational. She said, I had dinner with a family. They invited me to their home. The youngest child asked me if I had children, and I said no, and she said that was sad, and then immediately asked if I wanted to see her drawings. The drawings were of space, ships, stars. She said she wanted to be an explorer when she grew up. She did not distinguish between human space exploration and alien space exploration. To her, space was space and exploration was exploration, and the question of who was doing it was secondary to the fact of it happening. I said, and what did you think? Holt said, I thought about the orbital platforms and the 400 ships and the contingency systems. And I thought about how a species builds orbital platforms and contingency systems and also somehow produces 8-year-olds who make drawings of stars and want to be explorers, and I couldn't figure out how those two things are the same species, and then I realized they are the same thing. The platforms are built by adults who were once those children. The children will grow up and build the next generation of platforms. They build their weapons from the same place they build their wonder, and the weapons are just the wonder, protected, the reaching, defended. She said this quietly, and I wrote it down, and it is, I think, the best thing anyone said during the entire mission. Part 13, but never made it back. The Accord of Mutual Standing, which is what the partnership agreement was eventually called, in the Sarathi record. Humans called it the Geneva Compact, in the human one, was signed on the 142nd day of our presence in Earth's solar system.
I will not detail all of its provisions, which were numerous and complex, and took 60 days of the most intricate negotiation I have ever participated in to reach. The broad terms were as follows. Earth was recognized as a sovereign world outside the integration structure of the Sorathi Dominion, with full rights of self-governance and self-determination. In exchange, Earth entered into a mutual defense and information-sharing arrangement with the Dominion, a genuine one, with Earth contributing intelligence and strategic analysis and eventually vessel participation in joint operations. The Dominion contributed access to its accumulated knowledge base, introduction to the other species of the broader galactic community, and something that was not in the formal text of the agreement, but was understood by everyone at the table: protection. The acknowledgement, implicit and then explicit, that Earth was no longer a target. The 6 council members who had voted against partnership registered formal objections to the final terms. They described the arrangement as a precedent that would undermine the Dominion's integration framework across all future first contacts. They were right about that, and they knew they were right, and the 11 who voted in favor also knew it, and had voted in favor anyway, because the assessment data from Earth made it impossible to argue that the integration framework was adequate to all cases, and the Earth case was clearly not all cases. There is a footnote in the Council record from that session, added by the Chair, that says, "The Dominion's first contact with humanity represents the most significant departure from established protocol in the institution's history, and should be understood as a precedent specifically applicable to cases where the standard assessment framework produces recommendations inconsistent with strategic reality. It is not a general revision of Dominion policy. It is an acknowledgement that policy must be capable of encountering its own limits." That footnote is now studied in the Sorathi Diplomatic Academy. I understand there is some debate about what it means. I know what it means. It means that a civilization 11 centuries old was forced to admit, by a planet of 8 billion people who had been building in the dark for 7 years, that its assumptions about the shape of the universe were not the shape of the universe. The signing ceremony was a formal occasion, but not a large one. The chamber held perhaps 60 people. The Secretary-General and his senior team, Admiral Chen and her operational staff, myself and Holt and Teth Aaron and Serath Vel. Documents in both Sorathi and English, signed in both languages by both parties. A brief formal statement by the Secretary-General, which I will not quote in full because its eloquence does not need my description to be apparent, but which included the words, "We did not build all of this because we wanted a war. We built all of this so that we would not have to fight one." And a brief formal statement by me, which said, "The Sorathi Dominion came to this system with a set of assumptions about what we would find, and found something we did not anticipate. The measure of a civilization is not whether its assumptions are ever wrong, but whether it is capable of correcting them. We are correcting them today. We hope this is the first step in a relationship that will, in time, make both of our civilizations larger than either of them is alone." Chen signed her name to the document, and then looked up at me and said, quietly enough that only I heard it, "You almost didn't make it back." I said, "Wrath's transmission." She said, "Before that, your fleet, your 11 ships, when you came into this system." She paused. "The outer system autonomous systems were active from the moment we confirmed your fleet identity. They were tracking you the entire time. If you had made a hostile move, any of your ships, in any configuration that our systems read as an attack posture, the response would have been automatic and would have been impossible to abort. I want you to know that. I want you to know how close the entire thing was, from the beginning." I said, "You are telling me that for the entire 47 days of formal assessment, your automated systems were actively prepared to destroy my fleet if we took an incorrect action?" She said, "Yes. From the moment you dropped out of transit velocity at the edge of the system, to the moment the accord was signed this morning. 142 days. Continuous. We were ready the entire time. I thought about 142 days. I thought about my crew going down to the surface and having dinner with families and talking to children who wanted to be explorers and looking at drawings of stars. I thought about the concert and the Secretary General's story about the deaf composer and the long golden light on the cobblestones of the square. I thought about all of it happening while, somewhere in the dark of the outer solar system, systems built by those same people waited with absolute patience for a signal that never came. I said, "You are a remarkable people, Admiral." She said, "We have had a lot of practice at surviving remarkable situations." She looked at the signed document on the table, and something in her face shifted, briefly, quickly, controlled before it fully formed. And then she said, "Fleet Second, take care of yourself on the way home. The galaxy is large and we are new to it, and we would like to have the opportunity to meet more of it before it meets us the wrong way." I said, "I will do my best." She said, "That's all anyone can do. Aliens came to conquer Earth, but we never made it back. Not because we were defeated, because we were changed. Because you cannot spend 142 days in the presence of that kind of life and return the same." Epilogue. What came home? We departed Earth orbit on the 143rd day. 11 ships, all present. 63 days of transit home, in the deep quiet, in the silence that our poets had called a cradle, and our philosophers had called truth, and our admirals had called safety. I spent those 63 days writing, not the official report. That was done. I was writing something else. Something I was not sure I would ever submit or publish, but which I needed to write because there are certain things that a person experiences in their life that cannot be adequately processed without the act of writing them down. What I wrote was this: we went to Earth to conquer it. I say this plainly because the euphemistic language of integration and assessment and productive engagement no longer seems adequate now that I have seen what those words actually meant from the inside. We went to assess a planet with the intention of absorbing it into our structure, and we found a planet that had built in the dark, without knowing precisely when we would come, everything necessary to ensure that we could not absorb it, and had then offered us something better than conquest, a relationship, an acknowledgement that two civilizations might have more to offer each other as partners than as conqueror and absorbed. I wrote, "They did not defeat us." Let me be precise about that. If the accord had not been reached, if Wrath's transmission had been genuine, or if the Council had voted 7-10 the other way, there would have been a war, and the Dominion, at sufficient commitment, would have eventually prevailed. I believe that. I also believe that the word prevailed would have described a Pyrrhic outcome of a kind the Dominion had never previously encountered, and that the cost of that prevailing would have reshaped the Dominion in ways that were difficult to predict and possibly catastrophic. What they did was simpler and harder than defeating us. They made it not worth it. They looked at what was coming, an empire that had integrated 41 species over 11 centuries, that had never lost a war, that was approaching with the calm certainty of the perpetually victorious, and they built, quietly, methodically, with fear as their fuel and 8 billion years of human engineering instinct as their engine, a situation in which the cost of conquest exceeded the benefit, and then they sat down at a table and offered us a better option and were, throughout the entire process, polite. The politeness. I keep coming back to the politeness, because it is the thing that is hardest to square with everything else. The same people who built automated extinction systems in the outer solar system also maintained manual suspension on those systems for 40 minutes when an unauthorized transmission could have triggered them, because they wanted to give the relationship a chance. The same people who constructed 5 orbital weapons platforms in 4 years also invited my crew to dinner with their families and had their children show us drawings of stars. The same admiral who had, for 142 days, held her finger a breath away from ending my fleet, said to me at the end, "Take care of yourself on the way home." How do you write in Sarathi a report about that? How do you convey to a civilization that has never lost a war, what it feels like to stand across a table from a civilization that has never stopped losing and rising across 10,000 years of its own history. And look at what that cycle produced, and understand, really understand, that you were looking at something that all your centuries of winning had not prepared you to face. You write it honestly. You write it completely. You write it without the softening language of bureaucratic distance. And you hand it to the council, and you trust that 11 of them are wise enough to see what the honesty is pointing at. And apparently, 11 of them were. Holt found me writing on the 41st day of the return transit, in the same place she had found me watching the human transmissions on the way out, in my quarters late in the ship's night, with the glow of the screen the only light in the room. She sat down across from me, and for a while she said nothing, and the ship moved through the deep quiet between stars. Then she said, "Are you going to recommend changes to the assessment protocol for future first contacts?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What changes?" I thought about it. I thought about what we had failed to see and why we had failed to see it, and what kind of protocol change would produce a different outcome in a similar case. I said, "I'm going to recommend that the assessment framework include what I'm calling a capability potential index, a measurement not of what a civilization has done, but of what its industrial and engineering infrastructure could do if redirected toward a specific problem. The Earth case shows that visible output is an unreliable indicator of actual capability in a civilization with high general technological development. If you have the infrastructure to build complex things, you can build complex space things given motivation and time. We should have been measuring the general capability, not the specific space output." Holt said, "And the question of what motivates a civilization to redirect its capability? Fear, in Earth's case. What else?" I said, "That's the other recommendation. Before any assessment of integration suitability, we conduct what I'm calling a survival history index, a survey of how many times a civilization has faced existential level threats and survived them. Because the number and nature of those survivals shapes what the civilization builds for and how. Earth had survived ice ages, pandemics, global wars, near-nuclear destruction, climate crisis, economic collapse, multiple times, from multiple directions. Each survival had added capability and institutional knowledge for the next crisis. By the time we arrived, they had been practicing for existential survival for 10,000 years. We had no way of knowing that from orbital observation, because it is not in the orbital data. It is in the cultural and historical record, and we did not read that record. We read the technical survey. We saw the output. We missed the engine." Holt said, "If we had read the cultural record, would it have changed the council's initial vote?" I said, "I don't know, probably not at the council level, but it would have changed my approach. And if my approach had been different, perhaps Wrath would not have been in a position to make the decision he made. Perhaps the entire 142 days would have looked different," she said. "Or perhaps it would have looked exactly the same. Perhaps that is what a first contact with humanity always looks like, regardless of the approach. Perhaps the outcome was determined not by our decisions, but by what they had already built before we arrived." I said, "Maybe. Probably. Yes." She said, "Then the lesson is not that we should have done this better. The lesson is that when you encounter a species that has spent 10,000 years learning how to survive, you should start from the assumption that it has learned, not from the assumption that it hasn't yet." I said, "Yes, that is the lesson." She said, "Are you going to put that in the assessment protocol revisions?" I said, "Verbatim." She nodded. Then she said quietly, looking at the dark beyond the porthole, "I keep thinking about the concert, that piece in the second half." She was quiet for a moment. "A deaf man wrote something that beautiful, and he never heard it performed." I said, "He knew it was beautiful. He wrote it from the knowledge of what beauty was, even when he could not experience it directly anymore."
She said, "That's what they do, isn't it? They proceed from knowledge of what is possible, even when the direct experience of the possible is not available to them. They build ships in the dark. They compose music in the silence.
They hold their weapons ready for 142 days and drink tea with the enemy and invite them to dinner and show them drawings and say, 'Take care of yourself on the way home.' They hold the contradiction. They hold all of it, simultaneously, and they keep going. The deep quiet was very deep and very quiet, and the stars outside the porthole were the same stars they had always been, indifferent and ancient and beautiful, and neither of us said anything else for a long time." Final entry. Fleet Second's personal record. The fleet decelerated into Sarathi Prime system on the 63rd day of the return transit, as scheduled. I filed the formal report, submitted the protocol revisions, and testified before the Council's review panel for 6 hours over 3 days. The Accord of Mutual Standing was ratified. The 6 dissenting councillors registered their objections formally, and then, as the Sarathi system required, accepted the majority outcome and moved on. Fleet Third Holt was promoted to Fleet Second of her own arm. Teth Aaron retired and wrote a monograph on alien development curve analysis that became required reading at the Survey Academy. Serath Vel was appointed head of the new Earth Relations Bureau. Rath faced the Council's judicial authority. I testified on his behalf, not because what he did was defensible, but because what he did was human, in the sense that it came from a place of genuine conviction, however catastrophically misapplied. He served a reduced sentence. He spent it, I was told, reading the cultural history of Earth. I hope it changed him as much as it changed me. I returned to Earth 7 years later, as the Dominion's first permanent ambassador. The Secretary-General had retired. Admiral Chen had not. She met me at the shuttle platform personally, which she did not have to do, and which was not required by protocol, and she said, "Welcome back, Fleet Second," or, "I suppose it's Ambassador now." I said, "It is." "Thank you for meeting me." She said, "I wanted to." She paused. "The trap is bigger now, by the way, just so you know." I said, "I assumed it would be." She said, "It's not aimed at you anymore." She looked out at the sky, where Earth's clouds moved in slow patterns over a planet that contained, beneath its surface and in the dark of its outer system, capabilities that the broader galaxy did not yet fully understand, and said, "We turned it outward. There is a lot of galaxy, and not all of it reads reports as carefully as you did."